Hi, I'm Tom Morrison, and this session is called Soil Bugs That Sustain Us. Today, Joel Williams and I are going to play the bad cop, good cop game. On the one hand, I'll describe how bad it can get, what happens when soil bugs, the microbes, the fungi, the invertebrates, stop sustaining us. And on the other hand, Joel will describe how good it can get. He'll highlight the benefits that can accrue when we nurture them. I'm going to confront you, perhaps even shock you, with the story of North Korea, which in the 1990s turned its back on nature, abandoned crop rotations, arable grassland and ruminant livestock, and tried to rely on chemical arable farming. I'll show how international aid helped North Korea back on the road to agricultural recovery and towards food security. And I'll also briefly describe how my North Korean experience pointed me in the right direction when I started farming here in this country, just half an hour from Oxford. That'll take about 20 minutes. Then Joel Williams, the good cop, will reveal to us the potential abundant rewards as he takes us through the science and practice of plant and soil dynamics, including soil microbial activity and carbon sequestration, again, for about 20 minutes. That leaves us with about 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers relating to both presentations. Please text your questions to me on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Few of us know what it's like when soil bugs stop sustaining us. Perhaps some of us have read gloomy forecasts of what will be the result of farming the way most farmers do. One of the least controversial estimates by the UN's Global Land Outlook is that 1/3 of the world's soils are severely degraded already. That should set alarm bells ringing, but for most of us, this sort of statement goes right over the top of our heads. We take soil bugs and the good that they do for granted. So did I. Before I started farming, I spent 45 years traveling the world, working for the main agricultural aid agencies. I worked in over 40 countries, visiting some of them multiple times. I saw some wonderfully sustainable farming systems, for example, in the Himalayan region and parts of Eastern Europe. But more often than not, I saw unsustainable farming systems. After all, that's what agricultural aid agencies are for, focused on developing countries. But unsustainable farming systems are not confined to the developing world. We have plenty of examples in this country too. Looking back, I now realize I was fortunate to work in North Korea during and just after their disastrous famine. Though I didn't feel fortunate at the time, I now realize how valuable the experience was. I visited North Korea over a dozen times, starting in the late 1990s, accumulating nearly a year there, and I worked in 8 of the 9 provinces for several aid agencies. For those of you who don't know that part of the world, think of Italy. Much of Italy, like North Korea, is beautiful and mountainous, and like North Korea, it also grows Japanese rice in the Po Valley. The famine killed about 3 million people. That's nearly 15% of the population. I had seen famine and its consequences in several parts of the world, but this was in a class of its own. One statistic still haunts me. Of those who survived, according to UNICEF, 42% of those who were children during the famine lack full cognitive ability, UNICEF's words, due to insufficient animal fat. I'll come back to that later. What caused the famine? What caused rice yields to fall from over 8 tons a hectare to less than 3 tons in the space of a few short years? Government offered all kinds of reasons, none of them convincing, from extreme weather events to withdrawal of Soviet support to farming. In the year 2000, on my second visit, I was leading a team for IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, a bank, and we decided that the problem, as distressingly awful as it was fundamentally simple. no rotations in the arable system, and almost no ruminant livestock. As a result, the soil bugs had stopped sustaining. They were dead. The soil itself was dead. The soil structure physically collapsed. The seemingly ever-resilient soil had reached a tipping point. There was no resilience left. We proposed to the IFAD board that it should invest over $30 million, persuading the North Koreans of this simple truth. The board agreed. An absolute condition of the loan was the inclusion of a 4-course rotation, which led to the introduction of more ruminant livestock. The project was itself hugely successful, but more than that, most of the other aid donors to North Korean farming swung in behind IFAD and also made these rotations and livestock a condition of their aid. And finally, the greatest prize for our collective efforts, the Ministry of Agriculture, as official policy at national level, adopted this way of farming, conservation agriculture, as defined by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and started applying it countrywide. Now, in 2019, a comparatively good year weather-wise, the national average yield of rice was just over 6 tons a hectare, still not up to the 8 tons of 25 years ago, but getting there. That's how long it can take to restore soil that has passed the degradation tipping point. It's a sobering thought. The year before, in 2018, a comparatively bad year weather-wise, average yields were 4.4 tons a hectare. In other words, that soil resilience that we rely on so much is still far from restored. 2020 figures, by the way, are known, but I haven't been able to get them from Pyongyang. I've asked for them. During subsequent visits to North Korea for various aid agencies, including FAO and the European Commission, I helped to drive home the fundamental message about soil fertility. And for the North Koreans, seeing is believing. They kept saying that heavy rain caused floods. We said, no, floods are primarily caused by degraded catchments and depleted soils. They kept asking for more hydraulic excavators to repair infrastructure destroyed by floods. The European Commission, the main provider of excavators, having read my team's evaluation report, which said that all the excavators in the world couldn't dig their way out of the fundamental problem, said no, at least not on their own, better to improve the degraded catchments and soils at the same time. Soil degradation doesn't kill people just by starvation. People also drown. The European Commission had been providing some money for emergency rescue equipment, but eventually put the bulk of its money into improving soils and catchments. Now, you'll be delighted to hear that these people are not dead. They're acting. It was a hot day, and for me and my team from the European Commission and our counterparts from the Ministry of Agriculture, they put on a spirited pretense of drowning and being saved with the European Commission funded equipment. They had a wonderful time. Summing up, at the end of the display, I made sure that our counterparts thoroughly understood the real problem: degraded soils. Now, in my remaining few minutes, I'm going to tell you about how my wife and I started farming, helped by the PFLA, the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. The 45 years I spent working in agriculture in developing countries, and especially the time I spent in North Korea, taught me that if I was going to farm, then it had to be based on some fundamental principles. Regenerative from both soil health and environmental viewpoints. Low risk, robustly resilient and sustainable, and, my wife insisted, high animal welfare. Furthermore, because I was by now in my 7th decade, Ease of implementation was important. And finally, being rather underpensioned, it had to be profitable. Hobby farming for me was no option. Then I thought, should I go organic? I remember the FAO's definition at the time, which loosely speaking was something like a passing phase, a logical public response to what some bad farmers are doing and shouldn't, a niche market for those that can afford it, and it won't feed the world. Actually, I probably wasn't clever enough to go organic, and I do admire those who've been successful at it. But then I thought, you can feed organic grain or imported organic soya to an organic cow and still call the product organic. That to me is wrong. A ruminant has evolved to ruminate. And this habit of feeding grain to ruminants is actually quite recent. I remember at university in the mid-1960s learning about the famous Dr. Preston of Reading University in the UK, who had just completed the first barley beef trials. Abundant fertiliser and agrochemicals, cheap oil, and ever bigger farm machinery had ushered in an era of cheap grain. This was a revolution, and now it's considered normal. But it's only 50 years old. So I was looking for something beyond organic. And then, after talking to Graham Harvey, a co-founder of this conference, I discovered the PFLA, which then had fewer than 10 members. It immediately made complete sense to me. All that was 10 years ago. And those fundamental principles I mentioned a little earlier, the PFLA passes them all with flying colours, and that has also been my experience over the last 10 years. My wife and I now farm a 68-hectare all-pasture holding in North Buckinghamshire with Aberdeen Angus, suckler beef, 25 cows and a bull, taking most of the progeny through to finishing and delivery to local butchers. There are three PFL aspects I want to touch on: the market, the science, and the farm practice. As you know, all the best business plans start with the market. There's lots to say and no time to say it, so I'll just say this. With COVID-19, sales of PFL products in general have gone through the roof. Why, you might ask? Well, one theory is that people can't go to restaurants, so they treat themselves to what they perceive to be something special. If you haven't tasted PFL beef, then you haven't lived. Another theory is that people perceive COVID-19 as a symptom of the natural world being out of balance. And there seems finally to be a public realization that we're all part of the natural world and we're dependent on it. They see PFL product as coming from a balanced farming system. Nor do I have time to say much about the science, other than it's increasingly going in our favour. I'll briefly mention just a couple of facts. First of all, we're all being told to eat foods with omega-3 fatty acids, mainly oily fish. But for those of us who don't actually like oily fish, PFL meat is a good and better balanced alternative. Second, half our brains are fat, and much of that fat is omega-3 fatty acid. Remember those North Korean children I mentioned earlier who lacked full cognitive ability because they weren't getting enough animal fat? Several of the silly and negative myths, here's just one, are being increasingly debunked. Briefly, the science says PFL products are better for you, better for the cow, and better for the environment. I want to spend the few moments I have left on the third aspect, farm practice, because the benefits of PFL are not really about the cow, it's the how. I'm now in my 8th decade, so let me start with ease of implementation. When you go with nature's flow, things get a lot easier. Also, where I can hire high-tech farm machinery contractors, I do, specifically haymaking and barn mucking out. Actually, barn mucking out isn't a big deal because almost all my animals are out year-round. The hay is fed in the winter from a quad bike and bale trailer, and it's easy and a joy to do. there's a mix of high tech and PFL. Goes really well together. Second, productivity, something the UK doesn't do very well in farming. Notice I don't identify profit first, though the farm has been profitable every year. We have high productivity and we make a profit because our costs are low. On top of that is the price premium we add to stores and carcasses just because we're PFLA certified. The butchers I sell to can easily absorb that, and they love telling the PFL story to their customers. I don't have time to go into detail, but on the PFLA website, you'll find all the management data in an excellent publication called Pasture for Life, It Can Be Done. Third, good husbandry, old-fashioned term. Pasture-fed livestock are free to express their normal behavior. They feed on a natural diet of pasture and forage, and partly because of this, and partly because they live out all year, are healthier with reduced incidence of diseases and use of antibiotics, and they live longer. All these translate into lower costs. Unsurprisingly, it's the native breeds that are best suited to this traditional management. Fourth, risk and risk resilience. This is mainly about lower input costs, higher margins, and both of these provide operational resilience. It's true that my animals take longer to finish than cereal-fed animals, but since my costs are so much lower, that's not a big deal. Finally, and perhaps most important of all, PFL farming is regenerative. It builds soil organic matter. You may say that no-till arable does that too, but pasture and ruminant livestock do it better, an awful lot better, as this slide from Gabe Brown's book shows. Gabe Brown is a North Dakota no-till farmer who has seen his soil organic matter in that second to column on the right go under pasture, go from less than 2% to more than 6% in 25 years. So what's the conclusion? There are 3 points. It's difficult or impossible to farm sustainably without livestock and grass in the rotation. Capital and variable costs for PFL systems are comparatively low. PFL is profitable and low risk, and its products command a price premium. And the third point, the PFLA's direction of travel is aligned with DEFRA's vision for the future, with the UK's international commitments on climate change, and with agroecological ambitions identified elsewhere in this conference. The core message that I want you to take away today is that the last 75 years since World War II is just a short historical blip. Yes, we've achieved record yields, but at the same time, we've increased risk, reduced resilience, and squandered our natural capital, the soil. The Pasture for Life farming system is at the forefront of ways that can reverse all that, and we can do it within the ambitious time frame that we in this country have set ourselves. Now, with these 2 short stories of North Korea and my own farming experience, I hope I've prepped you well for my colleague, Joel Williams, who, unlike me, is a real soil scientist. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you very much, Tom. Pleasure to be here, and good evening or good afternoon or maybe good morning to some of you even. Pleasure to be here at such a wonderful conference. Tuned in a little bit yesterday, and yeah, really impressed with the breadth and depth of presentations. So today's presentation from me, or my part of the presentation, is going to be a little more introductory. We're going to take a beginner's kind of look at soil, the life in the soil. So we will be focusing on just telling their story, introducing them, and then we will move on a little bit on not just how they sustain us, but importantly, how we can sustain them in return. Okay, so the story then starts with plants, with this beautiful process of photosynthesis. The plants, of course, use the sun's energy and they breathe in carbon dioxide. They absorb water. And there they have the three building blocks, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they stitch those ingredients together to form their bodies, to form glucose, the very first product of photosynthesis. And then from that building block, they stitch that glucose together and make all sorts of other plant biomass and compounds. So through the process of photosynthesis, of course, plants grow and they build their bodies. Now, as much as we talk about plants breathing in carbon dioxide, of course, a hot topic these days in the context of climate change, but plants do not just take in carbon, they also do release carbon. They also do excrete carbon. And of particular interest or importance is the role of root hexudates. This is carbon compounds, carbon substrates, which are in one way or another, they are also products of photosynthesis or the photosynthetic health of the plant or potential of the plant. The plants will also leak or excrete these carbon compounds, sugars, carbohydrates, amino acids. They will excrete these down into the soil to feed microorganisms, to feed the life in the soil. Now, along with those food sources, the sugars and carbohydrates, inside those root exudates, there's also, it's a lot more complex. The composition of those root exudates is a lot more complex, very intricate. There's a host of other chemicals and their biochemicals. These are signaling molecules or communication chemicals in which the plant is also releasing along with those sugars to send very specific messages out to the soil, to the organisms in the soil. This is part of how they communicate. So it is a very intricate and dynamic process. Plants change the composition of their root exudates depending on all sorts of environmental factors, the plant nutrient status, environmental conditions, soil type, different plant species, even different varieties of plants have different composition of these root exudates. It's a very intricate and dynamic field. But nonetheless, the point is to say that the plants are giving away this carbon, releasing this valuable carbon that they absorbed. They are giving away specifically to feed, to nurture, to sustain the life in the soil. And in the soil is a whole community of life, ranging from micro and onwards up to larger macroorganisms, often referred to as the soil food web. Many of you may have seen images like this one. And the point is to say that, yes, it comes back to photosynthesis at the beginning. It is plants who photosynthesize, it is plants who deposit then that carbon, that organic matter or those root exudates. That carbon is the food or the fuel for that food web. And it is feeding all of those various living organisms. And we'll take a very quick look, introduction to some of these different groups of microbes here, starting at bacteria and fungi down at the bottom. They are the primary decomposers. They help to decompose that organic matter, feed and break it down, and absorb it. And this is a key first step. It's transferring that organic matter from being plant residues, being dead carbon, and turning it into living carbon, absorbing it into the living biomass of the organisms. And this transfer from dead carbon into living carbon is a really important process. So we have bacteria and fungi there at the bottom. They feed, and once they have then transferred the carbon and the nutrients from those root exudates or from those plant litters, well, then those nutrients can flow onwards and upwards throughout the rest of that food web. Those microorganisms will be eaten by some larger organisms, other microflora and fauna, all the way up to our larger fauna, earthworms and larger insects, etc., and then onwards to the birds and the larger animals. So this is the flow of nutrients throughout this community. But still, it always comes back to plants, comes back to photosynthesis. This is how carbon is coming from the air into a chemical form, into biomass, into those root exudates, which then begins this process of feeding and nurturing the life in the soil. So let's take a quick look at some of these organisms. Here we have algae. I've just sneaking them in quickly. We often don't talk about them enough. They are indeed microscopic plants. Consequently, they are little photosynthetic machines, little factories. So they are also contributing to that carbon supply, supplying the raw food, the raw material to feed all of the various other living organisms. So algae also important photosynthesizers in this context. And then we have bacteria. We're all familiar with bacteria. Microscopic organisms exist in soils in incredible numbers, incredible abundance, and also incredible species diversity, a huge richness of genetic diversity within the bacteria. And they feed on carbon, grow their biomass, and in the process of doing that, like all living organisms, they feed, they process, they metabolize, and they then excrete all sorts of byproducts or waste products. And these various kind of byproducts have many important functions in soils. Some of them are simply nutrients that the plants can then reabsorb, but bacteria can also release other compounds that can stimulate plant growth in other ways, antibiotic, antifungal type compounds to suppress diseases, or other more stable carbon substrates that can be sequestered into the stable carbon pools. So they grow and they die, and they perform all of these various functions as they do this, as they constantly grow and die, releasing various substances. Then we have fungi. They are, now we're moving up to multicellular organisms. Bacteria are single cell, fungi are multicellular, and they grow in these long strands or threads under the ground called hyphae, which bunch together to form mycelium. And again, fungi are also feeding on that organic matter and those residues, breaking it down, unlocking the carbon and the nutrients and cycling them, making them available. Fungi equally releasing all sorts of microbial, their fungal metabolites, all these sorts of byproducts, which again have many various important functions to support plant growth, suppress pathogens, etc. And as we all know, fungi, when they reproduce, they form these mushrooms, these reproductive structures that pop their heads up above the ground level. But predominantly those fungal strands, of course, are growing under the ground. Then we move up to, we have another special group of fungi. I forgot here, mycorrhizal fungi. You'd all be familiar with these. This fungi, it's a special type of fungi that forms that symbiotic relationship with living plants, with the living plant roots. And therefore they work together. The plant actually directly sends those sugars and carbohydrates, those photosynthetic products, directly down to the fungus where it grows. The word mycorrhiza means fungus root. It's literally a second root system for the plant. So it's helping to extend the root system of the plant. And the fungus receives that carbon from the plant, scavenges moisture and nutrients, and delivers those moisture and nutrients back to the plant in exchange. So they are a very special group of fungi who live in that synergistic relationship with plants. Then we also have protozoa. So here we're now moving up to the predators. These are organisms now that more so eat each other, eat other different organisms. They don't as much feed on the carbon, on the organic matter, the residues, those exudates. They do, but they predominantly are predators. They begin to eat other living organisms. So here we have some pictures of some different protozoa. And they are known for eating particularly bacteria. They graze on bacteria. And again, like all organisms, they graze, they feed, they process, they metabolize, and they excrete, again, all sorts of these byproducts, which can provide nutrition for plants to reabsorb, etc. Then we also have nematodes. They are what we might call a microscopic little worm-like organism. And again, they're very important for that nutrient cycling. We have nematodes that eat fungi, nematodes that eat bacteria, and nematodes that eat each other. And again, as they eat each other and eat and consume, they are cycling and making nutrients, performing this important role for supporting plant growth. Then, of course, we're moving up to some of our larger insects. I chose this picture just because it's exceptionally beautiful and shows that wonderful diversity there. But insects in the soil, they also perform lots of very important functions, moving into a slightly more macro scale. So insects, they're very important for shredding organic matter. They primarily process it, they break it down, they shred it and rip it up. And that enables more efficient digestion for the bacteria and for the fungi to break down those raw organic materials once the insects have shredded and broken it up. And of course, as they then burrow and move around in the soil, they're larger organisms, so they're moving around. They will also help to then mix some of that organic material, mix that important fuel for the food web, mix it throughout the soil profile. So insects also great diversity in soils and many other beneficial functions in which they perform, along with, again, grazing and eating some of those other microorganisms. And then we have earthworms, of course. Again, we're all familiar with earthworms, so I won't dwell on this, but just to say that as we move up to these larger macroorganisms, we typically call these the ecosystem engineers. It is the tunnels and the channels in which earthworms create, ants, termites would be other examples, in which now we are, and you can see over on this image on the top right-hand side, and we're creating all these channels and tunnels. And this is creating opportunities, pore space for gaseous exchange, for oxygen to come down into that soil, for water to be infiltrated and move throughout that soil. So, of course, earthworms will feed on residues, organic litters and materials, digest that in their stomachs, break that down, and excrete those various waste products of theirs into the as worm casts, again, rich in nutrients for plants to absorb, etc. Okay, so there, as we move into this macro scale, they perform more of these wider changes to the structure of the soil, hence the name ecosystem engineer. So that kind of, then above that we have, as I mentioned, our birds and some of our larger animals, which I won't dwell on for today. So we kind of summarize this community as this soil food web in this nice simplistic kind of image. I think one of the take-home messages is that a functional food web has to have the presence of all of these organisms. If we have one group missing or being compromised in their function, well, it will have knock-on effects throughout the rest of the function of this food web. They are all interrelated and interconnected. So it is important to have a nice diversity, a good diversity of all of these organisms to ensure that functionality. And as useful as this image is here for educational purposes and to simplify the learning and the thinking around these kind of soil ecosystem and soil food web dynamics, in reality, it is a lot more complex and intricate than what we depict here. And here's, for example, another example of a soil food web, which, as you can see, is going to a little bit more finer detail. And indeed, we have all sorts of different organisms that interrelate and feed on each other in many different ways. So, again, here, I can't point to this, but you can see the bacteria and fungi also in the kind of the center slide here. And then a whole range of other different organisms that specifically insects that feed on those fungi, nematodes that feed on that fungi. Again, protozoa feeding on bacteria, as we touched on, earthworms grazing on bacteria. And we're moving up into these other insects. Up on the right-hand side, we've got all sorts of other predatory mites that eat, yes, bacteria and fungi, mites that eat nematodes. It gets a whole lot more intricate and complex with, in reality, in where the nutrients are flowing, the channels in which the nutrition, the carbon flows as it moves up through that food web. So it is a lot more interrelated and intricately overlapping than perhaps what that simplistic image depicts. And here's a nice way of describing that. And indeed, then in recent times with genetic and molecular tools, we are looking at the soil, particularly microorganisms, but looking at the soil community in much greater resolution than we ever previously used to. And indeed, there's a lot of new understandings that have come from some of our new molecular and genetic analyses. And one small example would be of the protozoa, the protists here. again, that classic view that we've always said that, well, they primarily graze on bacteria, they feed on bacteria, and that's their niche that they occupy. There's been a lot of recent evidence highlighting that protists are a lot more diverse in their function within soils. Indeed, we have protozoa that consume fungi, and indeed we have protozoa that are omnivores, certain species that will graze on both bacteria and both fungi, and we even have protozoa that will feed above them in the food web. There are protozoa that will consume nematodes. So nutrients do not always flow in that one direction. It's not a unidirectional direction flow of nutrients. Indeed, nutrients can flow back down the soil food web and circle and cycle. And so that's a good example of, there's a lot of new evidence, what perhaps I might call soil food web 2.0, new understanding that molecular tools have given us that highlight that this underground community really is much more complex than we used to think in our kind of classic soil food web thinking. So just to then put this up, I'm sure many of you may have come across this one. I would just like to signpost the listeners, if you're looking for more information on soil biology and understanding more of these, this is a wonderful text that has just been published at the end of last year. This would be a wonderful starting point for anybody that wants to learn more about soil biology. Very comprehensive, 500 odd pages of information all about soil bugs and with a particular focus on soil biodiversity. So you can search for this publication and you'll find a free copy online. All the reading that you could want and more. So I'd really encourage people to have a look at that one if they're looking for more information. So that's the characters, that's the organisms in the soil. Let's have a little bit at the benefits or the functions and the benefits that they can bring to us as land managers. So the point is to say that the benefits of organisms include many different things. There are a huge diversity of organisms that live there in the soils. They perform many different functions, and consequently there are a huge range of benefits that come and stem from them. So they can help to improve soil structure, improve the soil porosity, and that helps roots to grow, so we can improve rooting depth. Now, the deeper the roots we can grow, of course, the greater the resilience that we build into our plants and into our crops, into our pastures. So rooting depth is a really important one, and biology helps to structure the soil that helps with rooting depth. As I did touch on already, they help to cycle nutrients, help to solubilize nutrients from the soil, the mineral fraction, make them available, cycle the nutrients from the organic residues and materials. But also hold on to, retain nutrients. Nutrients are retained within the bodies of those organisms. When those nutrients are within the body of the organism, they are less prone to leaching through the soil, being volatilized off, for example. So biology plays a very important role in holding on to nutrients as well. These things then ultimately help to increase moisture holding capacity and nutrient holding capacity. Good biologically functioning soils, we will see better aggregation, better porosity. These things help improve water relations within the soil. Microbes can also help to decompose toxins, so they help to break down residues, all sorts of hydrocarbons, chemicals, pesticides, these kinds of things. They can help to detoxify an incredible array of pollutants, and there's a lot of potential in using particularly microbes to do this. They also help to cycle and digest that organic material, as I mentioned, break down residues, but also help to form soil organic matter. As they feed on and process and digest the residues, they grow their bodies, they release various microbial metabolites, byproducts. Many of those can be very stable and become stabilized into soil organic matter, but particularly as their bodies grow and die, it is their dead microbial bodies. This is called microbial necromass. It is the dead microbial biomass that, as we are now beginning to understand, plays also a very important role in building stable soil organic matter. So that's very important in the great wider conversation about climate change, is ensuring we are nurturing soil microbes, particularly, and as they die, their dead bodies can become stabilized within soil organic matter. And then along with that, they help to, as I mentioned, produce a whole range of byproducts that can promote plant growth through production of hormones or others, plant growth stimulants, antibiotic, antifungal compounds, protect the plant from disease, and again, sequester carbon. So all sorts of benefits that we see to biology. And, it's when we think about this context, we talk about the benefits to us from living soils, from biologically functioning soils. I can't help but be reminded of the very famous quote that you will all be aware of. Ask not what your soil biology can do for you. Ask what you can do for your soil biology. And I think this is a very important point, and really enjoyed Rebecca Hosking's lecture yesterday. She touched on a similar point, this view of nature, how we use nature as a tool. We go out into nature for our benefit, for our mental health, for our exercise, for our well-being, etc. We should also ask that same question: what can we do for nature in return? And that becomes where we will shift the focus now for the last few slides here. How do we support and nurture soil biology so that they can give us those benefits, so they can give us those various functions, perform those functions that help us in an agricultural context? And so we could boil it down to some very simple rules. Soil health principles, a great place to start, great ways to support soil biology, minimizing soil disturbance. Let's not tear their home up and turn their home upside down. Let's try and minimize any of those mechanical disturbances. We can also support their function through more crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, maintaining a living root, I'll come back to that one, or integrating livestock. These 5 principles can be applied in many different contexts, in many different climatic conditions around the world, but are a great starting point in order to support and nurture soil biology. Follow the soil health principles would be a wonderful starting point. Let's dive into a few more specific examples. Well, what about within the context of our cash crops? The key message is to grow more roots. It is roots that really feed soil biology in one way or another. They're much more important than what happens above ground. So grow more roots with our cash crop. That might be choosing certain species or varieties that produce more root biomass. An easy way to also do this would be a transition to perennials, or have a perennial phase within a rotation. Perennials do allocate more carbon down to their roots. They grow more root biomass. So that would be an easy strategy as well. In the future, we could look at breeding new varieties for these below ground traits to support more of this soil feeding through various root traits. That soil health principle, maintain a living root, a really important one. The more we have living roots, and therefore those root exudates excreting out into the soil, those exudates are highly efficiently feeding those various microorganisms and onwards and upwards into the rest of that food web. So the use of cover crops to extend the growing season, perhaps relay intercropping to also extend the time of living roots, all importantly avoiding bare fallows where as much as possible. Transitioning to polycultures, more multi-cropping systems and more diverse systems is also a good strategy. That way we see a more diversity of root types, root architectures, different species, different root exudates, etc. We could also use companion crops or intercrops specifically for their below ground traits. So choose a companion crop for its below ground attributes, choose a cash crop for its above ground attributes. Cover crops, again, just grow more roots, more species or varieties for more roots, and higher quality litters. The use of legumes, also very important. Legume litters break down more efficiently feeds organisms, and that helps to support more of this process. We could use a range of inputs to help to support soil biology. So there could be some nutrition to enhance root development. Things like phosphorus, sulfur, boron, these are very important minerals to support root development. Maybe some biostimulants, kelp, for example, seaweeds, they contain auxins. They're very important for stimulating root development. Other various biofertilizers, microbial inoculants and things, which can specifically enhance this function. Again, minimize that soil disturbance. That helps to preserve aggregates, maintain pore space and pore space connectivity. So however we can embrace that soil health principle, the better. And again, livestock, the use of more rotational and holistic grazing techniques. A key point being more time for root recovery. It's those roots that are so important to feed soil biology. And also diversity, transitioning to multi-species pastures. And the use of diversity is a very important tool, transitioning away from monocultures, away from biologically simplified landscapes, shifting from that uniformity to diversity and more diverse production systems. It can bring many benefits. More diversity of plants means more diversity of methods or modes of action in which we can stimulate the soil life and enhance their functionality. So again, it could be cash crops, wider rotations, the use of annuals or perennials. Again, using as many of these lists as possible. Summer crops, winter species. Again, cover crops, companions, intercrops. The use of biodiversity strips, hedgerows, of course, field margins, leaving tall grasses, etc., unmanicured wild spaces. The use of trees, agroforestry, silver arable, silver pastoral systems. In any of these things here, strategies here can help to bring more diversity, and that brings more diversity of roots, and ultimately that improves the functionality of the below ground life. So I'll leave you with another quote just to summarize then this message of let's use plants to feed soil biology, and this is quite a nice one. Modern agriculture grows plants from soil. Regenerative agriculture grows soil from plants. So it's, again, using photosynthesis and plant species diversity to then ultimately nurture and sustain those bugs that sustain us. Okay, thank you very much.
Joel, thank you very much indeed for that. What a lot you got into a short time. And I think I knew most of the facts. It was your perspective and your framework that was really valuable for me, and I hope for the audience at large. So thank you very much. Now, while you catch your breath, I'm going to answer the first question that we have here that our assistant has put there. And Joel, you might like to look down at the questions which she has, Claudia has pasted for you, and decide which one you want to ask. But I'm going to, I don't know who this question is from, but it is, are livestock absolutely necessary for good soil health? And do you have any thoughts on vegan compost? Yes. Vegan compost, of course, is wonderful stuff. I think, Joel, you would agree with that. Can it be done, though, on a field scale, on a landscape scale, on a country scale? I don't think anybody's ever even attempted that. And so small garden, fine. Big agriculture, probably no. I would just also mention that a vegan investor has invested in a pasture for life butchery very recently. And he said, I'm a vegan and I'm going to remain a vegan, and I like being a vegan. But I do understand that pasture for life is good for sustainability and regenerative agriculture and all the rest of it. And I'm just reminded also of a former head of the Soil Association. He wasn't actually head of it. I think he was chairman. And he had a farm in Norfolk. And he said, I'm a vegetarian and I like being a vegetarian and I shall always be a vegetarian, but I cannot farm without livestock on my farm in Norfolk. So, shack to their goo. I like eating meat. I know some people don't. But let's think about regenerative agriculture, agroecology, cooling the planet. Joel, have you selected one, or I could go on and answer the next one, but have you got one to answer?
I mean, I've got a few here, so I don't know which ones were the most highly rated, which I should tackle.
Okay, thinking about that then. I'll just do another one, and then you can answer the one that you choose.
Sure, fine.
This question is, Tom mentioned that rice yields are still recovering 25 years since identifying the issue. Are we missing out on yield potential here? And how can we jumpstart improving our soil health biology? I want to get there quickly. a very good question. Actually, Joel, I think you could probably answer that better than I could. I'm quite sure that you could do it quicker than 25 years. If at a country scale you had the resources and you were able to. Could you?
Yeah, I do think soils have taken some time to degrade, and consequently they will take some time to repair. I think we should be careful of over-promising rapid results, but I would say that yes, definitely longer than 25 years. We can begin to see important changes.
Yeah.
Okay, I would say even within the first year, you can begin to see changes. You can begin to see we're moving in the right direction. And generally, people, I would say, might say 3 to 5 years is perhaps a good window where you can really turn things around in that kind of a time frame. Yeah,
I'd absolutely agree with that, Joel. But of course, we all know North Korea has political problems and doesn't want the support that may be offered to it. And I'm not sure it has been offered to it, but I'm sure scientifically it could be done. It's a political thing.
Yeah, I'll tackle a couple of questions.
You got some others.
Yeah, I got a few highly rated ones here. I've been notified. So one on does the soil biology differ between ruminant and non-ruminant production systems? And yeah, I've seen a little bit of work on this, and like always in the world of soil microbiology, the results are mixed. I would argue that yes, the point about including ruminants is that they, as an organism which contain, of course, many microorganisms all over and inside their bodies, their digestion particularly, and therefore in their manure, of course, that means that manure has a particular spectrum, a composition of microbiology that is unique to the animal, which you will not have within a non-livestock system. So indeed, you will be getting more of that very different groups of microbiology, which then get added to the soil through manure. So yeah, I think that, of course, we like to debate this, how essential are livestock. Of course, there are many farmers out there who don't have livestock and don't intend to. It's not to say that they can't have a healthy and functional soil. We can do it without livestock, but I do agree that it's better to do it with. I would support that notion. I think that's one of the definite big benefits. You're getting all of that ruminant various digestion, and that kind of links to one of the other questions there was about anaerobic versus aerobic in the context of there was a question there about compost teas and inoculants, and I think this is an important nuance in soils as well. We always talk about soils being aerobic and the importance of structure and aeration and oxygen for these organisms, and overall that point is absolutely valid, but in reality it's a bit of a finer detail in there that soils are heterogeneous. They are made up of both aerobic spaces and anaerobic spaces, and that's not to say that's bad. Again, it's about the balance between. So overall, soils are aerobic systems. Yes, we want oxygen moving through the soil pores, but for example, within aggregates, we actually want them to be anaerobic. We want them to be low oxygen. Within aggregates, under low oxygen conditions, that's how we stabilize some of the soil organic matter. If it's too exposed to oxygen, it will be oxidized off as CO2 and lost. Equally, we know that, for example, nitrogenase, which is a very important enzyme that nitrogen-fixing bacteria use, not just bacteria in nodules and legumes, but some of the free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, that nitrogenase enzyme that unlocks atmospheric nitrogen, it only functions under low oxygen conditions. So we want low oxygen within aggregates so that those are the sites of nitrogen fixation as well. So there is that simplified story that aerobic is good and anaerobic is bad. It is not so simple. It is much more nuanced. And anaerobic can be very good as well. It depends on what type of anaerobic and then the percentage. If the soil is completely compacted and totally anaerobic, of course, that's not good. But it's just to illustrate that some parts of the soil are anaerobic, some parts of the soil are aerobic, and that is perfectly good and functional. And therefore, that links to the livestock discussion. Of course, the ruminant is anaerobic. The earthworm's digestion system is also anaerobic. So we're getting those anaerobic organisms as an inoculant into the soil from manure and from earthworm casts. So I would argue that linking those two questions together there, that anaerobic processes are very important and functional in soils, just not too much of them, but you need some balance there.
That's great, Joel. Thank you. Our able assistant, Claudia, has said that this next question is highly rated, and I can't answer it, but I know you can. And I'm going to ask you, we've got 5 minutes left. And by highly rated, I think that more than one person has asked this sort of question. And it's there last on the list. Can you see it? Have you done any studies on glyphosate applications and its effect, if any, on the life below the soil surface? Now, there's a really topical, charged question for you.
Yes, indeed. My favorite. There is, like, again, always, there's a whole mixture of studies on this one. Some of them highlight some negative effects of glyphosate. Others can highlight very minimal negative effects. Now, it comes back to this discussion around every different chemical has a very specific mode of action, and only some groups of organisms will be sensitive to that mode of action. So when we then open the discussion to soil microbiology, particularly, and it exists in all its such diversity, we can't generalize about these things. So yes, glyphosate, or any chemical for that matter, yes, it will have some negative effects on some of the organisms that are sensitive to that mode of action. There will be other organisms present in the soil who are not sensitive to that mode of action and therefore will not be compromised. And it is those organisms then who will typically, of course, then play a role in decomposing, in breaking down, detoxifying, feeding on the chemicals as their food substrate. So they will then perform that function of breaking it down, detoxifying, so that then some of those other organisms that were compromised, so that they can reestablish or refunction. So sometimes the effects of chemicals can be transient, they can be temporary, it can be more of a temporary suppression. We do see that then some of the microbial activity can return after the chemical is then decomposed. So the answer to that question is a super loaded question and very nuanced. It really depends on the organisms. There's a whole mixed bag of studies kind of showing either way. It really kind of depends, and depends on how functional the soils are and how well they're detoxifying, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a simple question to answer, and it's a mixed bag of evidence, I would say.
Yeah. Joel, in the last couple of minutes, there's another one here which has got your name on it. I think I could probably begin to answer it, but you'll be much better. I would like to explain to my conventional, in inverted commas, farming neighbours the damage artificial nitrogen does to damage the soil food web. Please can Joel point us to information we can point them to?
Yeah, okay. This is, again, a bit of a mixed bag. So actually, we have some studies that show that some nitrogen fertilizer actually can encourage soil function, even improve bacterial diversity, for example. So small amounts actually begin to have some positive effects as we stimulate a level of nutrient cycling. Then, like all things, there's an optimum range. When we then start to apply rates in excess, this is where we can then also start to see some negative effects. Again, I would say it's high application rates, high doses that are more problematic. Some nitrogen fertilizer is not inherently bad. And again, it depends on the soil and its buffering capacity and that kind of thing. So it really, again, it's a nuanced answer, but it's a mixed bag. Some is quite okay. Too much then can be detrimental. In terms of where to get information, I am not sure. I'd have some papers. Maybe the person could email me. I'd have some stuff, but I can't think of it off the top of my head and maybe where they could go, but I do have some papers on this, which I
sure.
can.
Okay. Now, Joel, we're out of time, but there seems to be quite a lot of pressure for us to move to the Zoom. And I think our able assistant will show us how we're going to do that. Here we are. There's a Zoom link, which is being shared with the audience. I'm not sure what.
Yep. So if people just click on that link, and we'll all open up in Zoom, and we can carry on the conversation there.